welcome back to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host, Tommy Brzee. It is Tuesday, April 16th, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about some top 100 players list that was dropped by CBS yesterday. Wanted to break that down for you guys and see what teams are kind of dominating the top 100 in terms of the best players in the country. Then we're going to get back to spring game takeaways. Weren't able to really finish yesterday, so wanted to break down a couple more for you to hear today. Then we have another CBS-centered segment. We have Chris Hummer dropped his transfer portal superlatives. Wanted to break that down for you guys. Some teams to watch, some positions to watch, and some even players to watch throughout this next couple of weeks. And then we'll get into another Top 10 Tuesday, and I will take a whack at the best 10 players in the country. This is not an easy thing to do, so spare me a little bit. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show. And the best way for you all to get your question on the air, get me to see it, and I can respond to it, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, GSMCPodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to watch and have kind of an interactive experience here, which is fun for both of us. But let's jump right in. Let's talk about this top 100 list that came out from CBS yesterday. And it was Blake Brockermeyer that dropped it. If that last name sounds familiar, he is the father of Tommy and James Brockermeyer. James is currently set to be the starter at center for Bama, kind of beating out Parker Brailsford right now in that battle. And then Tommy Brockermeyer is heading into his second year at TCU after transferring over from Bama. Their father, Blake, is a remarkable college football player, was an All-American while he was there, and spent some time in the NFL. So obviously someone that knows football quite a bit, and he dropped his top 100 list. He does this quite a bit throughout the offseason, but his post-spring one is officially live, and it has some ers and ahs in there that I do not agree with. There's some that I totally agree with, to be totally honest with you, but just to give you an idea of what we're working with here. So he started it off with Travis Hunter, which is kind of hard to argue with, to be totally honest with you. I mean, when you look at that kid on both sides of the ball, he's one of the best players on both sides of the ball in the entire country. So it's pretty remarkable when that happens. He's obviously one of the best athletes in the country, so totally understand why he's his number one. He is not my number one, but you'll have to stay tuned to get my top 10. I'll kind of keep a little bit under wraps what I have, so we can keep some intrigue going into the last day. But as you see here, Colorado does have two of the top four players in the entire country when you talk about Travis Hunter and Shedeur Sanders, according to Blake Brockermeyer, but they only have one more player in the entire top 100, which is BJ Green, an Arizona State transfer who's at 77. So this Colorado team has talent. There's no doubt about it. Those two guys lead the way, but they lead the way by a pretty comfortable margin, to be totally honest with you. And if you've been watching the transfer portal news the last couple of days, they've been losing guys pretty much left and right. So I'll break that down later in the week, I believe. Have a show probably at the end of the week, likely going into Colorado and kind of the situation happening right there right now. But for the time being, it really does look like it's Shedeur Sanders, Travis Hunter, and everyone else pretty much on that team. So not necessarily a way to win a conference title or to do the things that Dion definitely wants to do this year, but still plenty of talent between those two, and as long as they can keep those two clean, especially Shedeur Sanders, they might have a shot to make some noise. But you have James Pierce Jr. at number 2 in the country. I think that makes sense. He's an absolute force on the defensive side of the ball for Tennessee, a guy that broke onto the scene last year, but is only going to keep getting better. He can put on a little bit more weight. He can get a little bit more nuance with his pass rush, even though it's already pretty great, to be totally honest with you. But definitely an absolute force there, and gives Tennessee a huge upside on that defensive side of the ball. Another D lineman there, Mason Graham here at 3. I think that makes total sense as well. An absolute force on the inside. Someone who's going to have to fill some pretty big shoes this upcoming year, but has the ability to, and is going to be one of, if not the best defensive tackle in the entire country. We talked about Shedeur Sanders already, but at number 5, we have Luther Burden, the first wide receiver on this board, and it makes sense why he's here. It does look a little bit interesting with him above guys like Jalen Milroe and Carson Beck and some of these other guys, but Luther Burden's an absolute game changer. If you watch Missouri last year pretty much at all, you saw him make a pretty remarkable play, I'm sure. So he's someone that totally changes the complexion of that team, totally changes the way that Brady Cook is able to look in that offense, because there are certain players that just elevate the people around him, and Luther Burden's one of those guys. That wide receiver room does not lack for talent even behind him, but Luther Burden really is what makes that all go, makes everyone kind of fall into their right position, and it makes everything work. So he's an absolute game changer. It makes sense why he's up there. And then you have your first offensive lineman here with Will Campbell from LSU at 6. He is the best offensive tackle in the country, in my opinion, an absolute game changer for LSU, and someone that I'm sure Garrett Nussmeier is very, very glad to have at left tackle, because it could be a very long year if he didn't have him at left tackle, and also Emory Jones, who's on this list as well. Actually, we'll get to him here in a second, but a very talented kid that absolutely could be number one off the board next year, depending on how things fall with the NFL draft. But then you get to some quarterbacks here. You have Jalen Milroe and then Carson Beck at 7 and 8. And to be totally honest, I would have these flipped. You'll see later on where I have these guys. But at the end of the day, I understand why he has Milroe this high. He's a guy that has not hit his ceiling yet, has the ability to even grow much more as a passer, I think, and even as, a runner. I think there's a lot of ability there, obviously, to start with, but I think that can only grow, to be totally honest with you. So I think Jalen Milroe has the ability to be one of the best, if not the best quarterback in the entire country. I would just give Carson Beck the slight edge right now, but Milroe's 1-0 against him, so I can't necessarily argue with that. But Carson Beck, right after him, an absolute surgical passer, a dude that is going to sit in the pocket and pretty much pick you apart with no problem. Totally understand why he's here. I think he's someone that is going to light the world on fire this year. I think a Heisman is maybe in the cards for him, so we'll see what happens there. And then he has Ollie Gordon at 9, which I was a little bit surprised about. I won't lie to you. I thought running backs would be a little bit further down the list, but Ollie Gordon was an absolute difference maker last year. He was the reason that Oklahoma State was as good as they were in a year where a lot of people tabbed them to be one of the worst teams in the entire Big 12. They made it to the Big 12 championship. Obviously didn't go their way in that game, but at the end of the day, Ollie Gordon not on that team, Oklahoma State's season looks a lot different. But then finally, they get to a player that Ollie Gordon faced off against in that Big 12 championship, in Kelvin Banks from Texas. This is a kid that, a lot like Will Campbell, started his freshman year and has only gotten better since then. I think everyone expects him to be one of the top 10 picks maybe in next year, definitely a first-round pick next year. As long as he can stay healthy, he is going to be an absolute huge player for Texas. And I expect him and Will Campbell, honestly, to be the tackles on the All-American team. But we'll see how that shakes out as the season goes on, obviously. But I'll take my whack at the top 10 later on in the show. So just so you know, I thought Shedeur being the top quarterback was a little bit surprising, to be totally honest with you. I thought Shedeur was not necessarily what I would put at number 1. I think I had him at number 4 when I ranked quarterbacks earlier in the year. But I totally understand why he has him there. He's an absolute difference maker. His ceiling is maybe higher than the rest of these guys, so I totally understand that. And then Ollie Gordon in top 10, I kind of talked about it. Was a little bit surprised about that as well. But let's get to some teams that kind of dominated this. As you see, you don't have any Ohio State players in the top 10. Well, that didn't necessarily hurt them in getting the most amount of players in the top 100. They had 7 different players in the top 100, and it started off at number 12 with Quinshon Judkins. And if you see those asterisks next to names, I missed one with Isaiah Bond. But those are some transfer players that have joined some other teams. So Quinshon Judkins was a big-time pickup for them. He's at number 12 on this list. Caleb Downs down at 19. Jack Sawyer, Emeka Egbuka, Travion Henderson, Denzel Burke, and Seth McLaughlin, the guy that transferred over from Alabama after not the greatest performance necessarily in the playoff games, but at the end of the day, a very talented kid that has the ability to be a big-time player for Ohio State this year. Then you followed up with Oregon, a team that used the transfer portal definitely in their favor. I missed one with Evan Stewart as well, so maybe this wasn't the best idea in the world, but you have Dylan Gabriel to start it off at number 20, then Evan Stewart, who was a transfer at 22. Malik Muhammad, Jamari Caldwell, also transfers that were big time for them. Jamari Caldwell is a guy that I think a lot of people will know the name very, very quickly as we get into this year. Then you have Tez Johnson and Josh Connerly. Josh Connerly is a guy that kind of like Kelvin Banks and Will Campbell, have only gotten better throughout their time. A guy that can be an absolute difference maker for them and makes life a lot easier for someone like Dylan Gabriel, who needs a little bit of time to kind of put everything together on the offensive side of the ball, and protection will help him immensely with that. So, but moving on down the list, we have a ton of teams stuck in 5. We have Texas, Georgia, Bama, and Ole Miss. But let's start with Texas, and let's talk about. We already talked about Kelvin Banks a little bit. He was the one that cracked the top 10 in this one. But Isaiah Bond right after him. You had Ewers literally right after Isaiah Bond at 15, and then you had C.J. Baxter and Trey Moore, a transfer from UTSA at edge rusher at 85 to round this out. So obviously 2 huge pickups there in the transfer portal with Isaiah Bond and Trey Moore. But obviously this is a very talented team. I was a little surprised CJ Baxter was on this list, to be totally honest with you, but a very talented kid that can do a ton of really, really remarkable things this year. But let's move on down to Georgia. We already talked about Carson Beck in the top 10. You had Malachi Starks, who I think could be a little bit higher on this list, to be totally honest with you. You have Tate Ratledge, Michael Williams, and Dylan Bell to finish it out. So a very talented group. All their top 5 guys are in the top 75. So obviously a remarkable group over there in Athens, Georgia, as there always is. But moving on to Alabama, Jalen Milroe we already touched on. Tyler Booker was the next on this list, which makes sense. An absolute force on the offensive line. That is going to be one of the best players in the country this upcoming year. You had Malachi Moore. You had Jaden Roberts, who's the other guard on this team, across from Tyler Booker. So that offensive line, at least interior-wise, is going to be an absolute force. We talked about James Brockermeyer earlier. It sounds like those 3 are the interior guys, and that's quite the 3 to have for run blocking and things of that nature on the interior side of the ball. And then you have Deontay Lawson to finish it out at 84. But Ole Miss got a ton of help with this new transfer portal rules and everything, and the big-time players that came in. They got 2 top 50 players in Walter Nolan and Princely Umanmielen. I think both those guys are big-time players for them this upcoming year. You had Trey Harris to start it off at 23. I think he's definitely the best player on this team. Jackson Dart, and then Caden Prieskorn. And I think the biggest thing here is the 3 guys that were already on this team that are in the top 100 are offensive players. The other 2 that they had to pick up through the portal are defensive. So you see the deficiencies that needed to be filled, and you see that Lane Kiffin has done a really good job in filling them, at least with the top-end talent that they absolutely need. And then we got 3 teams towards the bottom here with 4 players across the top 100. We'll start with Michigan. Mason Graham, we talked about, one of the best players in the country. A guy that just missed the top 10, Will Johnson, is an absolute game changer on the outside. Colston Loveland is one of, if not the best tight end in the entire country. I think him and Mitchell Evans are really vying for that top spot next year in the draft. And then Kenneth Grant, a guy that is going to be right next to Mason Graham this upcoming year, and a duo that I think could be as dominant as the Texas duo Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy were last year. So would be an absolute huge boost for Michigan, especially on that defensive side of the ball, and would give their quarterback a little bit of time to get his footing at least while they hold teams to under 10 points probably the majority of the time. But let's finish it off with LSU and Miami. LSU, we talked about Will Campbell. He's a game changer. Harold Perkins was a little bit misused last year, to be totally honest, but is still very, very talented. He comes in at 16. You had Mason Taylor at 48, the tight end that is an absolute beast. And then Emory Jones, the other tackle on this team, at 61. So 2 incredibly talented tackles on this team, both in the top 100 for LSU. gives Garrett Nussmeier a very good peace of mind as he heads into the season. And then Miami to finish it out. They started a little bit later in this list with Cam Ward coming in at 30, being their first guy, but Ruben Bain was very shortly after him at 33. I honestly think he could be even higher on this list as the season goes on. You had Xavier Restrepo at 62, and then Francis Mauanoa, the very talented tackle, at 98. So this is a very talented team in Miami. I think they've done a remarkably good job of building up that team since Mario Cristobal has gotten there, but it's time to start delivering, right? Coral Gables is definitely a place that they expect to be competing for trophies and be in the conversation for quite some time. So it'll be really interesting to see all that unfold and see what kind of happens as the season goes on for Miami in particular among these teams. But overall, this is a very, very interesting list. I think one of the things that really stood out to me as I kind of went through it was there are really talented players all over this country. We talked about Ricky White yesterday. He was on this list, the UNLV wide receiver that is going to get quite a few offers in this transfer portal window, if I had to imagine. And then you also had Torrey Horton Jr., excuse me, from Colorado State, another wide receiver that's an absolute difference maker. So you see that while, probably the next 200 people on this list would have been, Power 5 type players, there are really talented players all over the country, guys that can get drafted in the next level and make big time differences for their franchises pretty much right away. So I think this is a group that obviously, there's so much energy put towards the SEC, the Big Ten, the big dogs of college football, but there's plenty of talent all over the country. And if you just, every couple of weekends, tune into UNLV or tune into Colorado State or tune into one of these smaller teams, you'll be pretty surprised by the amount of remarkable players that are on this team and the amount of players that won't play in the NFL that still look incredible on the field, because there are a lot of just remarkable players across the sport that just don't quite stack up to the insanity that we see every Saturday. But I think this is always a very fun talking point during the off season. Always gives us something to get a little contentious over and get mad at each other over. But I'll do my best to give a top 10 later in the show. I think I did a pretty solid job, but I'm sure there will be people that totally disagree with me. But stay tuned for that later in the show. But we're going to take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about spring games. We got into some of them yesterday, UGA, LSU, some others, but want to break down the rest of them for you. We have Penn State, Bama, Tennessee, Miami, and Utah coming up, so stick with us, and we will be right back with that.